The Return of the Native is Thomas Hardy's sixth novel, initially published in the magazine Belgravia in 12 monthly installments from January to December 1878. The novel faced challenges in finding a publisher due to its controversial themes, but it received generally positive reviews. In the 20th century, it has become one of Hardy's most well-known and esteemed works. The novel has 6 chapters named Three Women, The Arrival, The Fascination, The Closed Door, The Discovery, and The Aftercourses. The major characters are 1. Clym Yeobright, the protagonist who returns to his native Egdon Heath after living in London. He is driven by a desire to improve the lives of those around him. His relationships are central to the story, especially with Eustacia and his mother. 2. Eustacia Vi, a passionate and beautiful woman who feels trapped in Egdon Heath and yearns for a more exciting life. She is in love with Clym, but her desires often lead to conflict and tragedy in their relationship. 3. Diggory Venn, a Reddleman who loves Eustacia and is deeply affected by her choices. His unrequited love for her highlights themes of obsession and sacrifice. 4. Mrs. Yeobright, Clym's mother, who disapproves of Eustacia and is protective of her son. Her relationship with Clym becomes strained due to her preconceived notions about Eustacia. 5. Thomasin Yeobright, Clym's cousin, who represents more traditional values and experiences her own struggles with love and societal expectations, particularly in her relationship with Damon Wildeve. 6. Damon Wildeve, a former lover of Eustacia and Thomasin, he is torn between his feelings for both women. His indecision creates tension and complicates the relationships among the characters. The Return of the Native is set in the picturesque landscape of Egdon Heath, in Wessex, and follows the events that unfold over a year and a day. The story begins on Guy Fawkes Night, as Diggory Venn, a Reddleman who supplies farmers with red mineral called Reddle, is transporting a young woman named Thomasin Yeobright in his van. Thomasin had planned to marry Damon Wildeve, but due to a marriage license issue, the wedding was delayed. In distress, Thomasin seeks the help of Venn, who is secretly in love with her. Venn takes her to her aunt, Mrs. Yeobright, who wants to ensure Thomasin's happiness and encourages Wildeve to fulfill his promise to marry her. However, Wildeve is still infatuated with Eustacia Vi, a beautiful and enigmatic woman living on the heath. Eustacia, who despises the heath but constantly roams it, is seen as an outsider by the local community. After Eustacia realizes that Wildeve will never provide the grand life she desires, she sets her sights on Clym Yeobright, Mrs. Yeobright's son, who has returned to the heath after a successful career as a diamond merchant in Paris. Eustacia sees Clym as her ticket to a more glamorous and fulfilling life away from the heath. The two fall in love and decide to marry, despite objections from Mrs. Yeobright. Meanwhile, Wildeve marries Thomasin, who gives birth to their daughter the following summer. Clym and Eustacia move to a small cottage nearby and experience a brief period of happiness. However, conflicts arise as Clym becomes devoted to his studies to become a schoolmaster, while Eustacia hopes he will abandon his plans and take her abroad. Clym's excessive reading leads to near blindness, and he decides to work as a furs cutter to make a living. Eustacia, feeling trapped and disillusioned, finds herself living in a humble hut on the heath, married to a man of lower social standing. Wildeve reappears in Eustacia's life after unexpectedly inheriting a large sum of money. This newfound wealth gives him the means to fulfill Eustacia's desires for a better life. On a hot August day, Wildeve visits the Yeobrights' home, finding Clym asleep after a tiring day of furs cutting. Eustacia and Wildeve engage in conversation when Mrs. Yeobright unexpectedly arrives, hoping to reconcile with her son. Eustacia becomes alarmed and ushers Wildeve out through the back door when she sees Mrs. Yeobright. She assumes Clym has awakened and called out to his mother. Eustacia briefly remains in the garden, But when she returns inside, she finds Klim still asleep and his mother gone. She realizes that Klim had only called out his mother's name in his sleep.
Mrs. Yeobright, believing she has been deliberately barred from her son's home, sadly begins her journey back home after seeing Eustacia looking out the window and climbs gear by the door. Later that evening, Klim, unaware of his mother's visit, discovers her dying from an adder's bite near the path to Bloom's End. Despite his efforts to save her, Mrs. Yeobright succumbs to the combined effects of snake venom and heat exhaustion. Klim is consumed by grief and guilt, which leads to physical illness that lasts for several weeks. Eustacia, burdened by guilt, cannot bring herself to confess her involvement in the tragedy to Klim. When Klim eventually learns about his mother's visit and Wheeldieve's presence from a neighbor's child, he rushes home to accuse Eustacia of murder and adultery. Eustacia, refusing to explain her actions, expresses her disappointment in Klim and accuses him of cruelty. She decides to move back to her grandfather's house, where she battles despair while awaiting any communication from Klim. This series of events deepens the rift between Eustacia and Klim, as well as intensifies the emotional turmoil and conflicts within the story. On Guy Fawkes Night, Wildev visits Eustacia and offers to help her escape to Paris. However, Eustacia realizes that accepting his help would mean becoming his mistress. She tells Wildev that she will send him a signal at night if she decides to accept his offer. Meanwhile, Klim's anger towards Eustacia has subsided, and he sends her a letter the next day seeking reconciliation. Unfortunately, the letter arrives too late, as Eustacia has already signaled to Wildeve and embarked on a journey through harsh weather to meet him. Despite her tears and the knowledge that she is about to betray her marriage vows for an unworthy man, Eustacia continues on her path. Wildev prepares a horse and gig and waits for Eustacia in the dark. Thomasin, suspecting his intentions, sends Klim to intercept him. By chance, Thomasin encounters Diggory Venn as she rushes across the heath in pursuit of her own husband. However, Eustacia never appears. Instead, she either falls or throws herself into the nearby Shadwater Weir. Both Klim and Wildeve hear the splash and rush to investigate. Wildeve recklessly jumps into the water without removing his coat, while Klim proceeds more cautiously but is soon overwhelmed by the raging waters as well. Venn arrives just in time to save Klim, but it is too late for Eustacia and Wildeve. When Klim regains consciousness, he blames himself for the deaths of his wife and mother, feeling responsible for the tragic events that have unfolded. In the epilogue of the novel, Diggory Venn decides to leave his life as a reddleman behind and becomes a dairy farmer. 2 years later, he marries Thomasin, and they find happiness in their settled life together. On the other hand, Klim, who has become a melancholic and solitary figure, eventually takes up preaching as a profession. However, it should be noted that in some editions of the novel, there is an alternative ending mentioned in a footnote by Hardy. Originally, Thomasin and Venn were not intended to marry, and Venn was meant to maintain his isolated and peculiar character while Thomasin remained a widow. Due to certain circumstances of serial publication, the ending was altered. Readers are given the choice to interpret which ending they prefer, with those who adhere to a more stringent artistic code considering the original ending to be the true one. The novel explores the consequences of unfulfilled dreams, the clash between aspirations and reality, and the complexities of relationships within the context of the hauntingly beautiful Egdon Heath. It delves into themes of ambition, sacrifice, and the limitations imposed by societal expectations.